favorite action platformer games Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64. When it initially began development, Perfect Dark was actually Rare's concept for a GoldenEye sequel before being outbid for the license by Electronic Arts. However, Rare was more than satisfied with their time spent in the James Bond universe and now preferred to explore more mature science fiction concepts. The inclusion and focus on alien races in a sci-fi world was heavily inspired by the X-Files TV show. Other influences from external media included the Ghost in the Shell manga, the 1982 film Blade Runner, and the postmodernist writings of Philip K. Dick. While production of Perfect Dark began using the same engine as GoldenEye, only about 30% of the original programming remained after being thoroughly upgraded to include larger environments, more textures, and real-time lighting. As was the case with most of the games released in the later half of the Nintendo 64's lifespan, Perfect Dark heavily utilized the N64 expansion pack for expanded gameplay features and higher visual detail. Development of Perfect Dark took nearly 3 years, the first half of which was supposedly quite unsatisfactory, leading to the departure of nearly half of the game's development team, including director Martin Hollis. Rare then increased the size of the team with new members until it was roughly 3 times the size of the team responsible for GoldenEye 007. After this, without the stress of deadlines or schedules, and even without a project manager, individual members of the team would contribute to the project with whatever they thought was cool and would work with the originally conceived story and ideas. We'll come to see how all of their individual ideas turned into something remarkable as we consider what's so great about Perfect Dark. Set in an alternate universe in the futuristic year of 2023, Perfect Dark focuses on the climactic events of an interstellar war between 2 alien races known as the Mayans and the Skedar. Also featured in this narrative are 2 rival human companies, the Carrington Institute, who are in league with the gray archetypal Mayan aliens, and the antagonistic Datadyne, who have agreed to help the reptilian Skedar aliens unearth an ancient and powerful alien ship in exchange for technology that will allow them to become the largest corporation on Earth. As the game begins, players find themselves in the shoes of Agent Joanna Dark of the Carrington Institute as she attempts to extract a defector from their rival Datadyne Corporation. At the time of Perfect Dark's conception, director Martin Hollis believed that there should be more video games starring women, and to that extent the team at Rare created Joanna, inspired by many other female protagonists including Dana Scully from X-Files, as well as the titular character from 1990 French thriller film La Femme Nikita. Joanna's name was also inspired by the French pronunciation for Joan of Arc. Following in the footsteps of GoldenEye 007 for the same console, Perfect Dark is also considered as a first-person spy shooter, focusing less on run-and-gun action than many of its contemporaries, and more on meticulous, objective-based gameplay. Just as in GoldenEye, each level of the solo campaign can be played on one of 3 difficulties, each with an increasing number of objectives, alongside increased enemy health, damage, and attention spans. If the player is ever confused as to what each of their objectives actually entails, then a more detailed briefing can be accessed from the pause menu, which elaborates a bit more on the locations and characters that a player should look out for, as well as the uses of some level-specific equipment. One particularly impressive piece of technology in Joanna's arsenal is the Cam Spy, which is a small robotic camera which floats as its own entity completely independent of Joanna. In fact, our protagonist and her futuristic drone can actually see each other in real 3D space, and can switch focus back and forth as desired. The Cam Spy can move virtually as freely as Joanna herself, being able to float at 3 different heights, strafe, and even open doors on its own. Many objectives in each level of the solo campaign can be completed in whichever order the player sees fit, supposing one objective doesn't grant access to another explicitly. With the completion of each stage within a certain time, the player will be granted a variety of cheats which can be enabled from the main menu for use in both solo and multiplayer gameplay. The cheats range from aesthetic-only categories to ones that change the gameplay or grant the player specific weapons for use in the campaign. The shooting range in the Carrington Institute features unique challenges for every weapon in the game, from handguns to explosives. Each challenge has 3 difficulty levels, requiring more dexterity and expertise from the player in terms of aim and movement as they improve the skills they'll need to beat the campaign on its highest difficulty. Every weapon in the game also has a secondary function for the player to familiarize themselves with for more elaborate gameplay. These extra functions range very wildly, from something as straightforward as the revolver's pistol whip attack, or the Dragon assault rifle's function of being thrown on the ground as a proximity explosive. The developers at Rare heavily admired Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation, and wanted to expand upon the stealth mechanics present in GoldenEye 007. As demonstrated in the first level, sometimes the player has to use non-lethal force to incapacitate someone without killing them. To that extent, you can even shoot the guns out of enemy hands to get up close and knock them out. As had become popular in accuracy-focused shooters like GoldenEye 007 and Medal of Honor, enemies are very responsive to which part of their bodies they're shot in. There seems to be an animation for every possible hit, so that the visuals of each firefight don't look repetitive from the same tired death animation. If they're not mortally wounded, but for instance suffered a bad hit to the leg, enemies in Perfect Dark will also limp towards safety or a better position to return fire. I wouldn't say that the enemy AI is necessarily smart, but it is impressive for its era. Enemies will jump, roll, or run out of the way of danger, and if their weapons are shot out of their hands, they'll try to pick it back up or replace it with a weapon already close to their feet. If your foes are close enough to you, they'll even try to disarm Joanna or attack you hand to hand. In terms of its visual presentation, Perfect Dark may have some of the most impressive lighting on this generation of hardware, with lens flares from the sun through glass, or the glare of artificial lights depending on where or how close you stand to the source. I wasn't even aware the Nintendo 64 was capable of lighting and reflections of this caliber. In the Carrington Institute hub world, the marble floor is so clean and bright that the reflections of walls, doors, and furniture can be seen as they're smoothly rendered based on the player's perspective. The contrast of light and dark was actually intended to be a much more significant part of Perfect Dark's experience, as the title might suggest, but this involvement of light levels and the use of a player-held flashlight was all scrapped due to the Nintendo 64's hardware limitations, though that isn't to say that darkness wasn't explored to the fullest of Rare's capabilities. For instance, the third stage of Mission 1 features night vision combat after the enemies knock out the lights. There isn't much indication as to what's going on other than the screen going black, but luckily, players are given a little time to figure things out, as the first enemy, who's behind a door anyway, won't fire their weapon until the player approaches them or fires at them, presumably because they figured out how to activate night vision. Even in the worst case scenario, the lights will be restored after 90 seconds, so the game can continue in the face of player error or confusion. In later levels, players will also have access to X-ray and infrared goggles to change up the way they look at the world around them. Aside from the multitudes of internal locations found in its campaign, such as military bases, alien ships, and even aboard Air Force One, Perfect Dark also features several unique outdoor environments which are most often used as opportunities for sniping. For instance, the second mission takes place at a bright, sunny villa, and drops the player into a tense hostage situation which they have to change the tide of with a sniper rifle. Later on, while being hunted down at a snowy crash site, the player will get a chance to take out their enemies from afar once again in the mountains with stark lighting from a dramatic red sunset, in contrast to the earlier outdoor segments which still presented a very natural and realistic setting. The sniping is still pretty archaic by first-person shooter standards, but featured an impressive degree of zoom on the N64, unimpeded by fog. Aside from the impressive gameplay found in the solo campaign, there are also plenty of additional modes added to Perfect Dark which can be played with 1 to 4 human players, with the rest of their positions being filled by bots. This obviously goes for general deathmatch modes or objective-based split screen, but even the campaign is opened up with very unique multiplayer opportunities rarely afforded to players even in modern games. Once missions are completed in solo or co-op mode, they'll be unlocked for counter-op mode, which is an interesting competitive version of the campaign wherein player 1 controls Joanna as usual, however the second player controls the bodies of various enemy NPCs as they try to stop player 1. Whenever their current grunt soldier is defeated by our higher-powered protagonist, player 2 will jump to another body and continue their mission to stop Joanna. This competitive mode was inspired by 1999's The Matrix, in which agents within the Matrix could swap between various people at will. The counter-op mode does have to be 2 human players, however that's actually not the case for cooperative play. Instead of a screen-sharing human partner, players can actually team up with an AI-controlled ally known as a Perfect Buddy, who will join them on their solo adventures if there isn't a second player around. This cooperative AI partner can still die, so it isn't a free pass to complete more difficult stages altogether, but it still could give players the boost they needed to get through tricky sections. The bot-controlled second player is pretty self-sufficient in combat as well, though they obviously won't take care of any of the more involved objectives, such as those requiring computer hacking or use of the cam spy, leaving the player to work their way through the campaign themselves rather than just coming along for the ride. Perfect Dark is a great example of how rapidly the first-person shooter genre developed, from Doom's gritty, pixelated world of non-stop grunts and gunshots in 1993 to a format capable of telling interesting stories with more thoughtful inputs from the player just a few years later. It's wildly impressive for a game on the N64 to boast cooperative gameplay throughout its entire campaign, but to also allow this second player to be controlled by a bot as a sort of assisted mode for players having difficulty is virtually unheard of in most video games. As if it didn't stand out enough among its contemporaries, Perfect Dark is also one of the earliest first-person shooters, as well as one of the only N64 games at all to feature full voice acting during gameplay, even that of our protagonist, as well as an advisor over radio comms and multiple voice actors for enemy NPCs. Perfect Dark's substantial 45 minutes of cutscenes are also fully voice acted on top of being elaborately animated through motion capture. Altogether, Perfect Dark has a shocking amount of content not just for a Nintendo 64 game, but also a first-person shooter game. Not only is the campaign much longer than you'd expect, especially if you're working your way through the higher difficulties, but the additional solo content, such as the challenge modes and target practice, are actually fun in their own right, rather than acting as an optional training mode. Perfect Dark is also a rare instance of a game able to be enjoyed to its fullest, no matter if it's played by a single player or multiple. Each of these modes, from campaign to split-screen deathmatch, and regardless of player counts between humans and bots, can also be customized with cheats and player preferences for a unique and constantly replayable experience, all while pushing the visual and technical capabilities of the Nintendo 64 to its limits better than almost any other title in the twilight era of the console's lifespan. That is what's so great about Perfect Dark. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we took a look back at Perfect Dark. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Half-Life, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time. Sometimes in the world of gaming, it's easy to focus on successes and lose track of the potential that we could be missing. These days, gaming audiences have the benefit of excessive amounts of indie games and more annual releases than ever before. This means there will always be someone trying a new idea or flipping old traditions on their heads. In the 90s, however, during the 3D renaissance of gaming, nobody knew where the gaming market would be going and how to best utilize all of the great advances in technology that were taking place. After id Software cemented the first-person shooter genre on home computers, Rare took a shot at changing up the format to take a step away from demons and sci-fi with the unexpected success of a James Bond-inspired video game, and on the Nintendo 64 no less. GoldenEye 007 is obviously meant to be less scary or outright intimidating than the standard shooter games of the time, taking a step away from Doom and Quake's hellish worlds. There may be a few instances of startling circumstances, such as an unseen enemy behind cover or around a corner, but they're less likely to be dropped on you through secret switches that made up the majority of traps in id Software's major action games. One of the most important aspects of GoldenEye, especially in comparison to its contemporaries in the mid-90s, is just how many features made their debut in this game. How levels are completed and enemies are approached, how a player controls and navigates the protagonist through complex yet understated levels, and the obscene attention to detail visually, aurally, and thematically carve a new path towards a greater sense of realistic storytelling, not just through plot but gameplay as well. I'll explain what I mean by all of this as we cover all of the greatest aspects of Rare's breakthrough shooter game and try to put it into words. What's so great about GoldenEye 007? GoldenEye 007 was the first big shooter game to favor realism over spectacle. In fact, this was the first shooter game to really offer much of a story at all, with briefings on your missions and very identifiable objectives taking place where Doom or Quake would just have a wall of text, if that. You can also check your objectives much more easily than most games of this era by simply checking Agent Bond's watch, which will list objectives, weapons, settings, and your control scheme far more conveniently than many games would for years to come. The choice of text and diction chosen in the mission briefings has the same kind of sarcasm and humor that M, Q, or Moneypenny would deliver to Bond in a movie. It's a great dose of flavor text that adds just a pinch of characterization and humor that any silent and somewhat clinical gaming experience is missing. The enjoyment in GoldenEye surely doesn't come from spectacle, so little pieces of immersive text are a good way to break up each mission and put players in the shoes of James Bond. Your selected difficulty determines which objectives you have to complete, with the ranking of 00 Agent hosting every challenge, and the lower difficulties hosting a select number of that full list. Playing on lower difficulties will also offer the player more collectibles, such as body armor. In a stark change from many of the first-person shooter games released before GoldenEye, many of your objectives are also not directly related to violence. Sometimes you just have to help hostages escape, or hack enemy computers through the incorporation of many Bond-themed gadgets. Expounding further on the steps taken away from explicit violence, this was also a very early appearance of NPCs which you were specifically meant to avoid shooting. In a technical sense, this feature has existed in some aspects since light gun shooters like Hogan's Alley on the NES, but to that extent you could expect as much discretion from a carnival game of shooting ducks with water. Firing at citizens or other non-violent characters in modern games is often villainized or penalized, but back in 1997 many action games didn't have enough characters to spare just to have some hanging around as non-malicious bystanders. Action games used every ounce of memory they could to throw more threats and enemies at the player. You don't stop to think in Doom if a particular demon is friendly before blasting rockets and lasers. I don't think I was expecting this level of sincerity from a shooter game in this era. This game really isn't as inviting to just run and gun gameplay like Doom and Duke Nukem 3D, and if you allow enemies to surround you, then you're absolutely done for. It follows a bit more of a sense of realism in the fact that if you're in an enemy base or in another precarious situation, then you need to think about each move carefully. About halfway through the game, I noticed a severe spike in difficulty because by that point in the game you're expected to be in it for the long haul, and willing to play the way the game expects you to. I wasn't playing it very stealthy because I had been used to filling the boots of a demon killer in first-person shooters up until now. Instead, it's time to think more like a secret agent and act more decisively. If you slow down and actually take out enemies silently, then those overwhelming odds become much more equally weighed against the player's own skill. The immediate ownership of a silenced pistol in the first level, which can be witnessed upon shooting your first enemy, incentivizes the player against going in guns blazing, as could be expected in popular shooters at the time like Doom and Quake. This title is also one of, if not the earliest use of reloading that made an appearance in a video game, rather than your ammunition just being spent from a continuous cache until you run out of that type of ammo. While many early shooter games just had a certain supply of enemies present in each room or area of the game's level, GoldenEye was one of the earliest action games to just swarm the player with a steady stream of enemies until specific objectives are met. Some games get carried away with this feature, as it's now widespread in shooters and other games that just want to pad their playtime, but in GoldenEye it adds an impressive degree of realism and excitement to see an unending swarm of enemy soldiers pour out as you escape the base. They're already behind you, so as long as you don't take too long completing your final objectives, then it shouldn't really have an opportunity to bog down your experience. If anything, it works better than just a countdown on the screen as an incentive for the player to escape in time. The first level in GoldenEye 007 is littered with wooden crates that your enemies will hide behind. These crates are excellent level decorations for two reasons. One is they serve as a realistic destructible cover that would allow players to miss their shots until the enemy is revealed and made an easier target, and two, by containing extra ammo that the player can pick up to replenish any wasted shots during their last encounter. Both of these factors support new players who are likely to be struggling with aiming, which would be virtually 100% of anyone playing a first-person shooter, especially on a console, in 1997. Now, wasting ammo or having enemies hiding in impossible corners was no longer an issue that would keep this game's difficulty from a mainstream player base. Cameras will detect you whenever present, regardless of your difficulty level. So even if one of your goals isn't to destroy all of the cameras in a level, stepping in front of a functional camera will set off an alarm, spawning an additional group of enemies that will swarm the player. This prompts the player to be more aware of their surroundings, even down to the corners of rooms, in order to make sure they don't give away their position. Remembering the layout of a level can be extremely helpful, not only for finding your objectives faster after a failed attempt, but also for keeping yourself safe in dire situations. As long as you've got a safe corner to fall back to, you'll be able to handle far more enemies than you could if they were all around you. There isn't really a cover system, as we would eventually see throughout the shooter genre, but you do still need to use any available corners or choke points that are available to you in order to lessen the opportunities to be overwhelmed by enemies. Even though this game came out within the first year of the Nintendo 64's release, it still boasts one of the most comfortable control schemes on the entire system, especially impressive for a first-person shooter with only one analog stick. In fact, this was one of the few games on the N64 and even in the majority of console gaming to offer a left-handed mode. This flippable layout allowed players to hold the middle handle and joystick with whichever hand they'd like to control movement and shooting, while aiming and strafing could be controlled with your free hand on either side of the controller with mirrored inputs. Based on the fact that twin-stick use in first-person shooters still wouldn't become prevalent for a few years, this is actually the closest we would come for quite some time, and was far more accommodating to players who wanted freedom comparable to that of a mouse and keyboard. While it's basically essential due to the difficulty of controlling any first-person games in this era, especially with a controller, there's not only a heavy amount of auto-aim in each bullet you fire, but enemies are a fraction as accurate as they are in more hardcore shooters like Doom. Bullets will constantly whiz by you, but it's basically just an immersive form of theatrics that keep the action moving along, while also understanding that the player has to significantly readjust between every target. This may also be the first instance of your guns making different amounts of noise and therefore alerting enemies differently. There may have been an action game to do so before this, but none of the shooters have exactly had enemies that just roam or patrol until you show up. There's never really even been an enemy attention span in games prior to this. While this game is reasonably difficult to control, it is accurate. An attentive player is easily able to know when and why they hit or miss their shots and can adjust accordingly, even if that means arguing with the extremely sensitive N64 analog stick and a rubber banding aiming mechanic. Rareware's back to pushing graphical limitations on Nintendo's hardware just as they did with the Super Nintendo, but even this project was developed within a year of the console's release. GoldenEye would remain one of the most graphically impressive games on the console for quite some time, if not one for all time. The only other really popular first-person shooter game with 3D models at this point was Quake. On the N64, you still had Turok Dinosaur Hunter, but the heavy use of fog and repetitive environments represent how much more could have been possible, as was demonstrated in GoldenEye 007. The opening credits feature some really impressive texture quality for the time, portraying high-detail faces of real actors, notably Pierce Brosnan in the lead role of James Bond at the time. Another addition GoldenEye made of the format of first-person shooters would be cutscenes at the beginning and end of your missions that show your character in action. In previous shooters, you rarely saw your own character unless perhaps you died or looked in a mirror. Your viewpoint can be manipulated up and down with directional buttons, but it always centers around the middle of the screen parallel to the ground like in Doom. An additional detail in this camera's unique behavior is the slight bit of drag to it while turning, creating a slightly more natural feel than the turning on a dime that could be felt in more robotic predecessors. The camera will also naturally slope up or down as the player moves vertically, such as on a staircase. This is a great accommodation for perspective, because a player completely locked into horizontal viewing would constantly be hounded by threats above or below them. This basically means that GoldenEye could have more realistic and architecturally pleasing environments that didn't rely on subtle inclines or elevators like Doom and Quake. I had dabbled in playing this game in split screen with friends, and while I enjoyed it, I didn't really understand why it had such a notable place in the history of video games in the 90s. That was until I really compared this game to what other first-person shooters were available on the market at the time. The thing about GoldenEye 007 is that it was really the only game like itself out there. This was Call of Duty, Battlefield, Far Cry, basically any first-person shooter game with even a hint of realism or stealth. GoldenEye even preceded Half-Life by over a year. What made all of this even more impressive were the facts that A, this was a pre-existing property with a movie tie-in, B, this was a Nintendo 64 exclusive, and C, it somehow smoothly and impressively utilized the graphical capabilities of the new Nintendo 64 during a very transitional period in 3D game development. This game is so impressive and comes out of nowhere considering that first-person shooters were still a new genre. With the amount of polish in GoldenEye's user experience though, you could basically slap a few more polygons and a mini-map into the game and pass it off as a modern release. I can't in good conscience release this analysis without commenting on the split-screen mode of GoldenEye's experience. This local competitive deathmatch offered a fun and hectic opportunity for friends to battle it out in one of the most memorable split-screen showdowns to exist on console until the release of Halo Combat Evolved years later. The characters, weapons, and game modes of GoldenEye 007's multiplayer experience are still referenced to this day through affectionately named aspects of first-person shooters with any sort of competitive experience. As I've mentioned in a few previous videos, breaking up a monopoly on any genre is always a great step towards advancing the future of video games. The stark differences that Rare displayed in this console shooter showed the gaming market that shooter games weren't just about fast-paced action. This was an important step towards showing critics and players alike that this genre had room not just for blood-pumping action, but stealth, accuracy, and player thought. That is what's so great about GoldenEye 007. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we dissected the great aspects introduced in GoldenEye 007. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Mega Man, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.
In August 1997, a small team at UK developer Rare released a game that would not only help to define the Nintendo 64, but would reinvent an entire genre, changing the face of first-person shooters forever. That game was GoldenEye 007. In this video we'll hear from some of the developers behind its success and find out how the team came together, how the concept evolved, and what went into its creation. I'm on a retro tip, and this is the making of GoldenEye. Rare itself was founded in 1985 by two brothers, Tim and Chris Stamper. They had previously established another hugely successful company, Ultimate Play the Game, which was a defining developer in the 8-bit computer years, particularly for the ZX Spectrum. Rare was initially an offshoot of Ultimate, but when Ultimate was sold to US Gold in 1985, the Stampers began releasing games as Rare. This was the start of a long-standing relationship with Nintendo, with them developing over 40 titles for the NES between 1986 and 1992. That's a lot of games, but everything changed for Rare in 1994. After investing in some state-of-the-art and costly SGI or silicon graphics machines, Rare started to create 3D graphics using the hardware, which could then be pre-rendered onto Super Nintendo carts. Their demo impressed Nintendo so much that they bought a stake in Rare, a not insignificant 25% at the time, and offered Rare the chance to create a Super Nintendo game using this technology based on Nintendo characters. Rare chose Donkey Kong and developed Donkey Kong Country. Using this advanced hardware and techniques, Rare shot to the forefront of UK video game development, and Donkey Kong Country demonstrated an unprecedented quality of graphics on the console. Rare became a second-party developer for Nintendo, and between Donkey Kong Country and Rare's purchase by Microsoft in 2002, Rare developed exclusively for Nintendo consoles in the home, many of which were also published by Nintendo. Soon enough, Rare started developing for Nintendo's upcoming console.
And with an eye to the future, tomorrow begins today. Nintendo, the world's leader in video games, has joined forces with Silicon Graphics, the world's leader in visual computing, to introduce the most exhilarating, breathtakingly realistic 3D video entertainment ever witnessed. Project Reality.
Initially codenamed Project Reality and later the Ultra 64, the Nintendo 64 would take the capabilities of the SGI hardware to new heights. Several strictly segregated teams at Rare would work on different games for the new console, with one team working on a licensed game.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
First, let's meet the team who would be working on the Bond game. GoldenEye's credits were tongue-in-cheek film-style roles to complement the fact that it was a film tie-in, so I'll explain both those and each team member's actual role on the game. Produced and directed by Martin Hollis. Martin headed the team, so this credit is perhaps the most accurate. Martin studied computer science at Cambridge. Director of photography Mark Edmonds, who worked on the engine and underlying code. Mark had some programming experience, although none in games. Martin and Mark were the game's main programmers. Original screenplay by Dr. David Doak. David was responsible for the story and level structure and the gameplay mechanics in general. Dr. Doak is a real doctor, having studied biochemistry at Oxford and was a research scientist prior to joining Rare. Scenic art director Carl Hilton. Carl designed many of the levels, the weapons and the UI. Carl's background was in architecture. Production designer Duncan Botwood. Duncan built many of the levels and worked on the motion capture for the character animations. He was also the motion capture actor for all of them. Costume designer Brett Jones, often credited as B. Jones, another very apt credit as Brett designed all of the characters and also worked on the motion capture. Second unit director Stephen Ellis. Steve did some programming for the game, famously being instrumental in creating the multiplayer mode Last Minute and for coding a fully functional ZX Spectrum emulator into the game. Original music by Graham Norgate, who did all the sound effects, and Grant Kirkhope. Graham and Grant each composed roughly half of the game's soundtrack. There were of course several other team members with more minor roles, but this team of 9 were the core team behind GoldenEye.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it was a very small team. Obviously, I came on board first. Martin Hollis, the team lead for GoldenEye, came along and said, "Oh, we might be doing a James Bond game. Do you like James Bond?" And yeah, I mean, I love James Bond, so I said, completely honest, I said, yeah, absolutely love James Bond. Seen all the movies, know them all by heart. So I turned. The next day, I was basically moved out into this other building where there was myself, Martin Hollis, and Mark Edmonds, who were the two main programmers, and that was it to start with. That was the three of us. I mean, GoldenEye was hard. We took 2.5 years to make, and we worked unbelievably long hours. So we were at the studio from 8 in the morning until 10 at night, making this thing. And in those days, with the way Rare was funded, we were really left alone, and we didn't do any designs before we made the game, and the whole thing was made on the fly by us, just going, this would be cool, and this would be cool, and playing other games and going, oh, that's really fun, we should do something like that. And having that ability, being given the freedom and the time to just experiment and play around with stuff. There were so many talented people there, and you got to see what was going on, and we had that freedom to create because Nintendo backed the studio so well. So there wasn't this sort of pressure. I mean, there was pressure to deliver, but not pressure to deliver to a budget and to a time scale. It was like, make the game good first and foremost.
Well, I can tell you why we did end up with those titles was because Rare at the time didn't want to put credits on at all. It was just going to say by Rare Limited, but Martin Hollis fought for it, and the way we got round it was to become film creditors, if you like, and the closest thing to what I was doing was costume designer, because I was building all of the characters and putting them in costumes. So when it came down to it, I built all of the characters, did all of the animation, most of the animation cleanup, 2 of the backgrounds, and sorted out the sort of look of the front interface.
Just went to the GoldenEye block one evening just to see what they'd been up to. Martin was showing me the sort of flying around the levels that they'd sort of the early stages of what they had. There was no gameplay or anything at that point. It was just a fly through. Mentioned how much fun it would be to work on it and how much it would mean to me to do it. And I worked with Martin on Killer Instinct, so he knew what I was capable of, I suppose. And so that's sort of where that started. Still really early days. I mean, we didn't have any hardware or anything like that. No one really knew what the final specs were going to be. So there was a lot of just sort of finger in the air and thinking, well, it's probably going to be able to do this and do that. So it was a case of just writing some music and hoping that it would work in the, when we actually got the hardware in the end and stuff like that.
What's interesting about the team is that they were very inexperienced. In fact, of the 9 core members, only 4 had worked on a game before, and only 1 as a major role. Martin Hollis had worked on Killer Instinct, Graham Norgate had done music for Killer Instinct and for Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy, Grant Kirkhope worked on Donkey Kong Land 2, Carl Hilton did some art for Killer Instinct, but other than that, the team were all video game virgins. Several were artists or musicians who knew nothing about making games. Carl was an architect, and David Doak had come on as system administrator for the Silicon Graphics hardware.
The whole thing about GoldenEye is that none of us had made a game before, apart from Graham Norgate. Everybody else hadn't made a game. So no one knew what they were doing. It was all just like, suck it and see, so we all had a go with it, and sometimes that's why the best games are made, because you don't know what the boundaries are. You just go with your gut, right? And I think that's why Rare was so great. Rare went with its gut so many times.
The latter part of my degree and my PhD was working on protein structure determination. There's a computational side to that, so I got involved in that. And then particularly to look at these 3D models, in those days it was big, expensive, fairly specialized machines. And Silicon Graphics were one of the manufacturers of those machines. As a kind of byproduct of what I was doing, I did a lot of system administration for these Silicon Graphics machines. And I got back into following games again. And Edge was one of the magazines that everyone, it was like the Nerd's Face magazine, really, back in those days. And they were always advertising at Rare because they were expanding their teams to do the N64 stuff. And then there was an advert which was for programmers, artists, and we need a system administrator for our Silicon Graphics network. So I applied for it, not really expecting anything to come of it. I was interviewed by Martin Hollis and Mark Betteridge. Mark was one of the directors at Rare, and Martin was leader of the GoldenEye team at the time. And they offered me the job. And as I got to know them later, they were saying, well, I was the only choice. They didn't have anyone else who had the same experience. With the move to the 3D stuff, there was a general feeling that they needed to. I mean, certainly on the engineering side, they needed to get people who had more formal C programming kind of learning and stuff and things. And then, and there was a core of the mathematical stuff, because at the time the engines were writing the engine and doing all of the maths for that. I mean, it's fairly basic kind of vector maths and stuff, but it was slightly specialised at the time. So Martin and Mark Edmonds were both comp sci guys from Cambridge. B and Carl had done what was probably almost like the first wave of computer graphics degrees, because that was an incredibly new field. It was an insane hothouse of talent, Rare, at that time.
GoldenEye was my first job. Yeah, I mean, I'd never worked in computer graphics or anything like that at all, so coming into Rare was completely different. I mean, I had to learn the new software, which was Alias Wavefront at the time, version 4, which I had to learn from scratch, from a book and from a set of videotapes. And I had 3 months in a room on my own, learning how to do everything. Martin came into the office one day and said, okay, you're on this team. And that's literally how it started. I mean, it was the dumbest of lucks.
What I took along was all my architecture drawings and the animations that I'd done, but also lots of architecture stuff. And I'm into photography, so I'd done a lot of photography. So they offered me a job as an environment artist because I clearly understood buildings and light.
I mean, after the initial kind of wow, I'm here, I got quite frustrated with it because I enjoyed games. I talked with everyone about games. But I wasn't making games. I was the guy who came and crawled around under your desk, or fixed your monitor, or did this, whatever. So I was going to quit. And Martin Hollis and Simon Farmer, who was like kind of production manager at Rare, got wind of the fact. It was like, well, don't leave. I said, well, it's been great, but I'm not really enjoying it. They said, well, what would make you stay? And I said, well, the worst thing is not being involved in the games. And Martin said, well, maybe you could come on GoldenEye. So there was a kind of transition period where I was doing a bit of programming on GoldenEye, not clever programming, the safe parts, and still doing system administration, but just gradually, and then that programming turned into being more focused on getting the level design working and the single player game, really. I mean, if there's a part of GoldenEye which is my part, it is all the level setup in the single player game and the AI scripting for that.
GoldenEye was the first thing that I worked on, but I mean, so to start with, for like the first month probably, I was just in the main farmhouse, like in a little room upstairs, and they asked me to work on some graphics stuff, just working on the PC, like animating a character and creating skinned joints. So I had no idea what it was going to be used for or whatever. So I guess that was going okay, and so then I moved over to the barn, the GoldenEye barn. So it was just Martin and Carl were over there at the time. So then so I moved over to join them. I guess the company trusted us just to get on with it. So, and that probably instilled trust in us, or confidence in us.
The location was unassuming to say the least. Based out of Twycross in Leicestershire, Rare headquarters was remote, a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere in the countryside.
There were different barns, so there was like the main farmhouse, and then there were different barns which different teams were in, working on different games.
It really is in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, there's nowhere around it. And when we were at the farmhouse, there was chickens running around all the time, and there was 2 dogs. So there was probably about 100 odd people there, maybe. I mean, the thing is, you just didn't see them, quite honestly. That was the thing. You couldn't get into any of the other buildings, and you didn't really interact with people that weren't on your team.
Licensed games had a terrible reputation by the time that Rare acquired the license, and expectations were low. The original concept was to create a side-scrolling platform game for the Super Nintendo. Martin Hollis was keen to head up the project, but only if the game could be developed for Nintendo's new 64-bit console.
It was early 95. We'd just finished Killer Instinct. Yeah, I can remember having a coffee with Martin, and he was talking about having been asked about doing this game, and I'm sure it was at that point it was going to be a Super Nintendo game, so I'd imagine we'd be looking at a side-scrolling beat 'em up or something, as all film tie-ins were back in those days.
We weren't sure initially. I mean, there was myself, Mark, and Martin, and we were sort of talking about what we could do. Because obviously originally it was supposed to be a Super NES game, and Martin had only taken on the project on the condition that we could do it on the N64, because Rare knew that was coming. We'd been told by Nintendo that it was on its way, and we said, well, we don't want to do a SNES game, we want to do the SNES of the new Super Nintendo game, because Project Reality, as it was called at the time, because we knew it was going to be 3D, and we thought, well, 3D is much more interesting. So we were looking at 3D. I mean, initially we were talking about things like, do you remember the original GTA games, which was they were sort of pseudo 3D downward camera, facing camera, because it was kind of like Spy Hunter as well. So we're thinking, well, you could do, car chases and guns. It could be a sort of cross between GTA 3 and Spy Hunter.
The game then evolved to an on-rail shooter.
We were going to the local town and playing. There was a Sega arcade there, and we were playing a lot of Virtua Cop. And we thought actually Virtua Cop would be great, and we were playing a lot of Doom as well, and we thought first-person shooters fun, but we didn't know what the console could do, and we assumed it wasn't going to be that powerful. So we figured maybe an on rails like Virtua Cop, where you'd be taken around through the whole sort of movie on rails, and you'd shoot the bad guys, and and you could set everything up quite nicely. So that was our initial second plan. Was we'll do that, and we went down. Rare gave us some money, and we went down and played the whole way through Virtua Cop from start to finish.
Eventually it was decided that GoldenEye would be a first-person shooter, a genre which at the time was still commonly known as Doom clones.
Once the console turned up, the first version of the console turned up, and Martin and Mark started playing with it, they said, actually, I think we can take it off rails and we can actually make it like Doom. We can actually move you through it however you want to go. So the very first level I ever built was the underneath of the big dish at the end, Arathabo, and that had been built with a track in mind so that you went through and followed this path through it. So the first thing we did was turn that off, and then I had to go back and then sort of start ripping stuff out to make it cheaper so that the whole thing actually could run at a decent frame rate, because I'd done some stuff that was really expensive, but it didn't matter because the camera was only supposed to point in certain directions. But suddenly it was like, oh no, you can turn and look anywhere you want. This is going to be a free roaming first person shooter game.
So there wasn't anything running at that stage at all, but it would have. The plan for it was going to be an on-rail shooter, and then it just slowly evolved. Yeah, because Doom was on PC was like big at the time, and we were all playing it, so it just sort of moved towards that over time.
That was how first-person games were evolving at that time. You know, how do you make it not just about running around with red, blue, and yellow key cards and stuff? I mean, I have tremendous respect for Doom. The early Dooms were transformative, really. I mean, there was nothing before them. But there's not really the story is you kill monsters.